I'm going to be talking about a couple of COVID-19 surveys that we did earlier this summer. The group that worked on that included Ron Libeskin-Hadas, Susanna Humbrush, Lori Pollack, Nancy Amato, Jim Carosa, and several other CRA staffers in addition to me. Next slide. So we did two different surveys, and the timing on them matters because, as you know, this is a very rapidly changing situation. In June, we ran a survey of CS faculty, and in early July, we ran one of chairs. The chair surveys were sent to all the doctoral departments and to non-doctoral departments with a CRA connection. Either they were CRA members or they're participants in the CRA Data Buddies surveys. The faculty surveys were sent to the same departments by asking chairs to forward a link to their faculty, and then the survey link was also sent to the SIGSI mailing list. Next slide. Because we asked parallel questions of faculty and of chairs on some topics, we can compare their answers. This is the response on one of the key metrics about what the spring move online was like. How hard was it for the faculty and the departments? Non-doctoral faculty were the most likely to agree or strongly agree that the shift to online teaching was difficult and stressful. About 85% of them thought so. About 60% of the other groups, doctoral faculty and chairs at both doctoral and non-doctoral departments, thought that the shift was a challenge. Next slide. So given that the move online was a challenge, what might have made it easier? Answers might apply to online teaching in the fall. This is another comparison of faculty and chair responses. What resources were not provided for the spring move but would have been useful? Faculty and chairs both agreed that scalable exam resources were the most needed, and they also both agreed that the second most needed was additional training in online pedagogy. Although you can see that the faculty felt more strongly about the need for more pedagogy training than the chairs seemed to think. Next slide. So if how stressful and difficult it was for the faculty and departments is one metric for the spring, the other major metric is how did this affect student learning? Faculty were asked whether they believed their students learned about the same amount as they would have in person. Overall, about 35% of the faculty agreed and about 45% disagreed. There were differences in faculty at different institutions, but they were relatively small. Also, this is probably the place to note it, that we know that there's a difference between online teaching in a course that's intended and prepared to be online and the kind of emergency online instruction that most institutions were dealing with in the spring. And so you can't necessarily apply the lessons from the spring to online education in general. Next slide. So if students didn't learn quite as much as usual, what sort of challenges might have kept them from doing that? Faculty were asked what sort of challenges they thought their students faced. The greatest ones were family obligations, internet problems, and mental health issues. But as you can see, there are a number of other challenges that students faced. And of course, ones that weren't necessarily faced by a large number were very serious for the ones that they faced. For example, food insecurity.
Quick question, Betsy. What's a scalable exam?
I think it's looking, it's not so much that the exam itself is scalable, but that the ability to do the exam for a full class online was scalable.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep. We're going to move on. Hang on
right.
to your question, please, Armando. Next slide.
Next slide. Yeah. So unless you think it was all negative, faculty did think that there were some things that were better online than in normal practice. And one was being able to watch recorded lectures at a different time. And another was being able to watch parts of lectures more than once to get a better handle on concepts, and also being able to work at their own pace. Next slide. So moving from the student challenges to the faculty challenges. What were the challenges that the faculty said they faced after moving online? Their main two issues were that it was hard to implement their preferred teaching style, and that it took a lot more time. Next slide. So in the face of those faculty challenges, what did chairs think about the impact of the pandemic on their faculty members' work? Overall, they think it was hardest for the pre-tenure, tenure track faculty, with 80% of chairs saying that their work was somewhat or significantly impacted. Least hard hit were the tenure track faculty, the associate and full professors. But even then, least is still 64% negative. Next slide. We expected to find that junior faculty were having a particular problem. And so we asked the chairs additional questions about what they thought the challenges were to junior faculty in particular. The biggest challenge overall was the uncertainty about arrival of research graduate students in the fall. And then that was closely followed by childcare, travel constraints, and developing their research group. For non-doctoral institutions, setting aside the graduate student concerns that are less likely to apply to them, chairs felt that the greatest challenges to junior faculty were balancing teaching and research, travel constraints, and lack of childcare. Next slide. So a common question is about the status of faculty hiring. And what we found was that there wasn't a huge impact this year. A lot of the hiring was completed before things moved online, or successfully completed after moving online, despite some issues. But next year is far more uncertain. There's competing demands. One are our existing plans to hire, mainly due to undergraduate enrollment increases, but then heading the other direction are possible hiring freezes and other budget concerns. So we're just gonna have to keep an eye on it. We don't know what's gonna happen here. Next slide. And budget in general. There's a lot more detail on budget in the white paper that's associated with this chair survey. But chairs were asked about the status of 17 possible actions. And they were asked, has this already happened at your institution? Is it under discussion? Is it possible? Is it not expected? And then there was a don't know, not applicable option. The things that they were most likely to say have happened are a freeze on staff raises, travel restrictions on department funds, a freeze on faculty raises, changes in the department and faculty purchasing policies, and reducing the department operating budget by a fixed %. The things they thought least likely to happen were reducing the renewal of teaching faculty contracts, reduced retirement contributions, salary reductions, reduced graduate TA support, staff layoffs or furloughs within the department, and reduced undergraduate TA support. There are some differences between institution types on these, in particular comparing among the US doctoral units, comparing the public and the private. Privates are much more likely to already have experienced freezes on staff and faculty raises, purchasing changes, and reduced retirement contributions. Next slide. So that's where we stand now. What did the faculty and chairs see looking forward to the fall? They saw challenges. Next slide. So we asked the chairs about what they thought was going to happen with enrollment in the fall. And again, this is a reminder that this was a snapshot as of mid-July, and it's all constantly changing. There was no consensus about what was going to happen with undergraduates. Will the incoming freshmen or the overall undergraduate enrollment increase, stay the same, or decrease? There are probably some genuine differences between institutions, but there's also still a lot of deep uncertainty about what's going to happen here. As far as graduate students, there was more uniformity on the concerns, particularly about the visas of incoming international students, visa renewals, and having enough TAs because of issues with international students, and possibly a longer time to graduation for PhDs. And at this point, I guess I should point out that the CRA covers North America, and so this survey went to US and Canadian institutions. And Canadians were less concerned about visa renewals, but more concerned about having enough TAs because of issues with international students. Next slide.
Can somebody please mute who's on the phone?
So how are the fall courses going to be taught? 93% of the US doctoral and 80% of the non-doctoral expect a mix of online, hybrid, and on campus, but the exact mix is still evolving. On the other hand, 86% of the Canadians expect it to be entirely online, and nobody expects to be entirely on campus. In institutions offering on-campus courses, 67% expected to offer instructors a choice of whether to teach in person. Next slide. So we asked the faculty about their concerns about teaching in the fall. If they were teaching online again, then they were concerned about keeping students engaged, being aware of student difficulties, whether that was with the material or non-academic difficulties, continuing teaching best practices, and designing effective assessments. If they were going to be teaching in person, then they were concerned about social distancing, both in classrooms and in other venues, and they had health concerns, either for themselves or for someone else in their household. Next slide. We asked the faculty who had had a class moved online in the spring, if they were going to teach the same course online again in the fall, what would they do differently? The thing that most were going to change would be to include more online discussion and interaction, more pre-recorded material, and to update their material somewhat to increase student independence in learning. Next slide. So, since budgets are such a concern, we asked the chairs if they were considering additional income generating activities to fill the budget gaps. As of mid-July, the most common answer was none so far. US doctoral institutions are more likely to be considering alternatives, such as increasing enrollment in either on-campus or online master's programs or adding new online programs. And Canadians were more likely to be considering increasing the number of incoming freshmen. Next slide. We asked the chairs to give us a text response to the question, what do you perceive as your greatest department challenges for the upcoming academic year? Here are the themes that were mentioned most often. Resources, mainly budget, but also TAs and space. The demands of online and hybrid learning, managing that, managing the conflicting demands from students and faculty and administration, and in general, just managing to make that work properly. Uncertainty, providing quality education, and reduced enrollment in undergraduate and graduate programs. They were concerned that it affects revenue, but they were also concerned that it affects program sustainability. And in fact, there were several chairs in this comment who said that they hoped that when this was all over, they still had a graduate program. Next slide. So the recommendations that we came to from this are, we can't overstate how important it is to communicate, listen and communicate. Build community to reduce isolation for students and faculty, especially people who are new to your department. Follow up on mentoring and support for junior faculty and members of underrepresented groups. Keep in mind that the challenges that don't affect everyone strongly affect the ones they apply to. Daycare and research that requires physical access in some form are the two big ones. Everyone's stressed, including and perhaps especially the chairs. So the chairs managing the uncertainty and the workload without burnout is crucial. And the situation as a whole is going to need to be monitored for continued change and long-term impact.